I apologize for that in advance. Alrighty, so welcome everyone to the first session. I'm glad you all could make it. So I'm going to be the moderator today, so I'm just going to introduce our speaker. So we have Michael Schuckers here from Rutherford Professor of Statistics at St. Lawrence, and his topic is using statistical methods to improve NHL entry draft player selection. So a little bit about him, he is the Rutherford Professor of Stats at St. Lawrence University. He is the co-founder of Statistical Sports Consulting, LLC, and has consulted for organizations in baseball, hockey, and football. In 2013, he was named the American Statistical Association Section on Statistics in Sports Significant Contributor. Sorry, that was long. All right, so everybody welcome Michael. We're going to get to hear about his topic.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thanks to the folks for organizing, and thanks to you for coming. It's nice to be back in the Midwest. So, as was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about trying to improve sort of drafting using some data. So there. Before I go there, let me mention a couple of things because I'm often asked this. St. Lawrence is a small liberal arts college in northern New York, but we have NCAA Division I hockey. And so I grew up in Pennsylvania with lots of football, but for the past 15 years have been at St. Lawrence, and certainly analyzing hockey data, and now both of my sons have played hockey for many years, so now intensely working on hockey. So a little bit on the draft and the NHL in particular. I think the draft is one of the places, Tom Miller spoke in the keynote about performance. And I think the draft is one of those places that is overlooked or doesn't receive enough attention, because I think it's a place where you have access to players at a very discounted rate, at least for a couple of years, 7 years in the case of hockey. And so I think it's a place that probably deserves a bit more attention than it's gotten, not just in hockey, but probably in other sports as well. So it's actually nice, there are a couple of talks at the conference that will be on draft sort of topics. So, sort of start with a couple of quotes with some prominent hockey people. Anybody want to guess the source?
I'm going to say Lou. Oh,
and another one. Right, so it's interesting to put those two back to back from Berkey there. They're both from 2013, actually, from MIT Sloan. And so, seeing this was sort of the impetus for where we wanted to go. And so, the talk I'm going to give and one of the analysis I'm going to talk about is basically an idea of, can we actually improve drafting? Yes, we can, with data that's publicly available by sort of smartly combining information from a bunch of different sources. So, again, it's sort of a what if, I think, and I will talk about at the end, I think there's lots of ways to do this where we could have more information and better information. It was an attempt to grab what is publicly and easily available, relatively easily available, particularly when we talk about some of the historical hockey things there. But basically just looking at demographics, performance, and scouting. So I'm going to take those three components and say, can I combine them, and how do I do that? So demographics are just simple things here. I'm going to refer to height, weight, a player's age, and the position. Those sorts of measurements, what do I know about them right on the day when they're going to be drafted? What information do I have there? What has been their performance? Okay, what is their performance in terms of, again, the very standard metrics that we have. I haven't used plus minus here. More points per game, goals per game. We don't have save percentage historically going back, so I've got to use goals against. Again, not perfect, in fact, not great at all. I would prefer to have save percentages, but if I'm looking at 2002 and a prospect from the second tier Finnish league, I'm not gonna have a save percentage. Some of that is now available for the prospects that are being drafted now, but historically, and if I want to build my models and I want to be able to test and train and do all those smart things, I'm not going to have that. So I've got to go work with what I've got. I've got penalty minutes there. Did not actually use this as part of this, but it is something that we could have. And then on the scouting side, we have central scouting. So if we look at the sports landscape, hockey is a little bit unique in that the league actually offers and does scouting of prospects. And the league ranks them. We'll talk a little bit about it more, but the league basically puts them into 4 categories. We have North American skaters, North American goalies, European skaters, European goalies. And so we have information there that we can use, and we'll do that. So can we smartly combine all of that information and try and predict future NHL performance? Just a note in terms of what we've got in terms of efficiency for the draft, right? How well do folks do? This is actually Mike Lopez put this out back at the end of April in terms of the 4 different leagues. What you have is efficiency, which is a rank correlation. And rank correlation is going to be something that I'm going to use. That is correlation between ordered performance by some metric and then ordered draft selection by some sort of metric, and how those correlate. And we can look and actually see the NBA does really well, and then hockey has done well recently. I might be a little bit surprised by that bump up there. And I might argue that that actually has a bit to do with this fact, which is he only took the first 60 picks. We're going to look at 210. And then also with hockey, and you see the same sort of bump here with Major League Baseball, is you may not see fully the development of those players, particularly sort of late first and into the second round, which is, at least at the NHL, where that 60th draft pick takes you. Right? And so we may see that correlation actually drop as some of those players develop here. I don't remember the exact measure of performance that Mike is using there. My guess is for the NHL, it's probably games played, which is going to be crude. I'll talk about that in a bit. But it gives us a nice proxy that allows us to do comparisons across positions. Okay, given all of that, I guess I should note, right, the correlations here we're talking about are the NBA. Maybe we're getting to somewhere averaging just above 0.5. Everywhere else, with the exception sort of this trend here at the end, we're at about 0.5 correlation and below. Right? So that means we're not doing great. This drafting is hard. We are often projecting, right, what we're going to see from a player in 3 to 5 years with what I've got right now. Right? In the case of Major League Baseball, in the case of hockey, right, we're looking at 18-year-olds and likely when they contribute, certainly in most cases, we're looking at 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And so you're making this projection of what they're going to be. And so drafting is hard. Some illustrations here. I've broken things up into 2 draft classes. I'm going to mostly focus for this talk on the second one. But if you look at the paper that's out there, so the paper that we presented as a poster at MIT Sloan in 2016, that paper looks at both of these cohorts there. So just focusing on the latter group, right, of the first 210 players drafted, 55% never play. Never play a game in the NHL. If I look at those who played more than one game, 25th percentile is 18, right? Less than a quarter of a season. 75th percentile, 222 games, about 2.5 seasons or so. 2 2/3. I'm going to look at time on ice, and you see similar sorts of things, right? 184 minutes time on ice for those that make it to the NHL. an average of 3,800 minutes. If you think about 20 minutes a night, you can roughly get an idea of sort of how many games you're getting there. So again, roughly, even somebody who's playing, say, 15, 18 minutes a night, you're talking about 200 games again. So similar to what we had for games played. Every draft year from 98 to 2008, your median games played from that class is 0. All right, so we're talking about long tails of a distribution and a lot at 0. Right. And I've got about 21% of draftees play more than 50 games in the NHL. Again, here's sort of distributions. My responses that I'm going to use is going to be games played and time on ice. I'm going to use the first 7 years. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the first 7 years is roughly the amount of time that a team has a player until they become an unrestricted free agent under the current CBA and under the previous CBA. So again, right, we're talking about big spikes at 0 and then some long tails. Okay. The other thing is that our feedback is slow, right? We're drafting players at 18. And the feedback that we're getting is often not until we know what they become 2 or 3 years down the road. So let me walk you through this. So this is average minutes played by selection. And here we're averaging, I believe we're averaging 2 selections. So the first bar represents players selected first and second. The height of this first bar is, right, average minutes played that players selected first and second in those years, right? Played in their first year. All right, and then we add to that the amount they played in their second, in their third, and their fourth, and they get slightly lighter here. You'll notice that this black, right, we've got very little. We actually have some down here in later. In part, that's because we're using the data for this graph I used all the way back to 98, and you had some players, in particular these were older players, right, coming in at that time, mostly from Russia. And so you saw some additional. If we do that for more recent years, you're going to see very little of this black right beyond the middle of the first round. In addition, right, the second is dark. Again, it drops off. We see very little of it past the first round. I've got just the first 100 picks here. If I do an average by pick, and I do that for, again, for the first 100 here. Again, I've got time on ice, right? I've got fairly bumpy, right? As some people have noted, somewhere around 30 here, I seem to have a bit of a drop, right? And then I've got very, very noisy there going forward. Does tend to be fairly monotonic if we smooth it. But it does end up getting relatively flat. I should mention that this graph comes from a Shiny app. So Tom Miller mentioned R, one of those packages for making some nice apps and some dynamic graphs. And this is some work that a student, and I don't know if you can see my student's name there on that slide, but Gordon White, who has just graduated, put together this. And so there's a link. I'll send that out and tweet that out later today. The testing, in particular, we're still playing with the colors and the new version of ggplot, which has a different way of sorting things than before. So we're playing with those colors. So yeah, bear with us a little bit. But there are some nice things you can do, and if I got time at the end, I'll pull that up. Okay, a couple of fun facts. Here as we're going, if you go back to those older drafts, right, had 821 players that were drafted or ranked by Central Scouting. So Central Scouting does somewhere around 300, 400 players per year. That does seem to vary. For your most common leagues, not a surprise, right? Your CHLs, right? Your Canadian junior teams, OHL, the Dub, the NCAA, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about data and getting this data right and some of the challenges there, particularly historically. But for example, in 89 and 90, there were 5 Robin Olsens from Sweden, 2 forwards, 2 defensemen, and a goalie, and trying to sort of disentangle who was who and who's central scouting, which player was central scouting. Yes, it's a joyful data set. So again, the goal here long term, right, we want to try and get better at drafting. There's been a whole bunch of work that's gone on that. Translation factors have been used a little bit in drafting. They're mostly the idea of if a player is in one league, say the Finnish First Division, the Liga, right, and goes to the NHL the next year, what can I expect from them? And you've got that translation factor, and you've got a bunch of people who have done that. The central scouting integrator is something that Ian Fife did, and it's something that I used here in terms of a way to integrate the 4 lists that you have and the 4 categories. So how do I take North American skaters and European skaters, and how do I put that list together to give me a ranking? And what Ian did is basically just look at where players went in the draft and said, okay, if you're the 5th ranked European skater, you are likely to go in this spot. And there's a multiplier, I think it's 6.27 for European skaters. So if you're the 5th ranked, then you're likely to go in roughly the 30th spot for a European skater. And so that allows us to get a single integrated list of roughly where central scouting thinks a player is going to be drafted. Since the time that we started working on this, this Weisbach, Lawrence, and Jessup group, who've now all been sucked up by the Florida Panthers, also put out sort of a nearest neighbors approach to the prospect cohort success. So the idea of looking at what are the nearest neighbors to this player historically, and then saying what is the success of this group, and to be able to predict from there. There's lots of work on value pick charts and trades. Eric Tulsky has the one that looks at how do you create sort of the Jimmy Jones value pick chart for hockey. And lots of us, including myself, have done some work on, well, what is it, the actual performance that you're getting there from trades. And then along with a colleague who's now with the Carolina Panthers, he and I did a paper basically looking at do teams beat central scouting? Do teams actually improve over central scouting? And what we found is, yes, they do. And Steve does a lot of financial stuff. So we found that benefit was roughly about $2 million a year, which is, there's obviously a confidence band around that and some noise there. But historically, you're getting $2 million of value, which would give you an idea of, something that would be a scouting budget. Okay, to this thing that we're calling, or I'm calling draft by numbers. So back to rank correlation, I'm going to give you correlations, right, in ranks between the draft order and our response, and I'll talk about the responses in a second. And then I'm going to compare that to the correlation in ranks between the predicted response from our model, right, and the actual responses. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to those cohorts of draft classes through 2008. We're going to say, okay, I know how they did at the NHL level, right? And I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to build my model on data that was available 2008 and pre, and I'm going to predict how that 2008 class does. Okay. I mentioned the data here and some sources, right? Collected and merged using those 5 sources, and actually some LexisNexis sorts of things to historically go back and get the central scouting list that the Toronto Star published, for example. So some of it is automated, some of it's manual. As always, these sites have usage agreements. Make sure you're not violating them. Okay, the response I'm going to use is first 7 years of a player's career post-draft. And again, that's collective bargaining agreement time to unrestricted free agency. All right. I want to allow for comparisons across positions. So I'm going to use games played and time on ice. I'm not going to use points. Right. Points is hard on D and is hard on goalies. Okay. So points, again, is going to be hard. I should note, right, if we look at correlations between games played, time on ice, and points, over careers, that we're getting correlations that are pretty high. These things are going to be fairly similar in what we do there. Okay? And you can see some of this. So this is part of what I did in terms of my value pick chart, in terms of the draft pick, and this is scaled value, so I've set each to a max of 1,000. We've done a little bit of sort of low S smoothing here, and made sure of monotonicity. And so if you look, the blue lines and the pink lines are very similar because they're basically sitting on top of each other. And so what you have, the pink lines are the older, though I printed them after the blue lines. But you can see we're not seeing many differences between that 98 to 02 or the 03 to 08 cohort. Not much changes there. All right, just another slide here. This is games played versus central scouting integrator. So that central scouting integrator, again, taking those 4 categories, putting everything together, and then sort of plotting that on the X, games played on the Y. Again, not completely monotonic. We see a couple of little bumps here and there. But we're going to use this, and my point with this slide and with the next one is a lot of the things that we're dealing with here are not linear. Right, and so the model form that we're going to take, we're going to end up doing a regression, but we're going to assume things that are not necessarily linear, and we're going to allow that sort of nonlinear flexibility in our model. All right. Again, here, this is again first 7 games played. This is points per game in the year prior to being drafted. And what we've got here, I've got by position. So I've broken things up into center, D, forwards. It's going to be mostly left and right wings there. We see, again, first we've got nonlinear, and second we've got differences by position. So we're also going to, in terms of our regression modeling, we're going to have some interactions, and we're going to have different terms in there for each position. Okay, getting to that modeling, right? Ideally, if I'm going to be building my draft board, I've got to have a single model, and I don't have to have a single model, I've got to have a single outcome for where I think and where I project a player to be. Okay? And so, all right, I'd like to have a single approach that gives me all positions there. For my responses, I mentioned I'm going to use the first 7 years post-draft time on ice, or first 7 years games played. Okay? The regression I'm going to use is a generalized additive model with a log link. So effectively, this model is actually going to be multiplicative. That is, if you're exceeding the average, what we're going to do is you're going to increase your predicted time on ice by 20%. Right? And effectively, that log link is making the modeling. Yep. So again, the nice thing about a generalized additive model, right? I can flexibly build those terms into my model. Deal with nonlinearities, I've got that. The predictors, and then lots of interactions. Okay. The training data here for this, 98 to 2000. Okay. Only took players drafted and ranked by central scouting. Out of sample, I'm going to predict the 2007 and 2008 draft classes. Okay, with those responses, again, my rank correlation. So here, training data, out of sample, time on ice. The actual order that the NHL comes up with is 0.547. Right, our model comes up with a correlation that's 0.65. Again, these things are correlated, so we're seeing similar sorts of outcomes. In 2008, we don't do quite as well. We're still doing slightly better than the league did in terms of its drafting. All right. Just a note, I did some predictions last year for the Boston Globe, and so there they are, and it's kind of nice. Actually, last year was kind of easy. This year didn't do an extensive modeling, but you had no clear top folks because of this. And just note here, so I've got player, I've got their position, the league that they were in when they were drafted. Here's what Central Scouting said, and then here's when they were selected. And I'll just tell you a quick Charlie McAvoy story for the Boston fan in the back. No, she's not a Boston fan, so a Boston resident in the back. I should be clear there, right? Rangers fan? Huh?
He's at BU though.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. If you go to the NHL page right now, it says that he's got no NHL stats, which is a classic NHL.com thing. He played in the NHL playoffs last year for them, but yeah. All right, that's something else. Okay, so we've taken this model, we've done this complicated big process, we've done a little bit better. So what else can we do going forward? And hopefully we've proven the point that it's possible, right? So we just took the previous year's performance statistics. We could certainly go back to an earlier year, right? Lots of these players are playing in the OHL or et cetera than years before, right? I mentioned save percentage. Better data would be so much more helpful, but again, that's very time consuming to grab. We didn't use anything on whether they played for their national team. We didn't use anything on the quality of the team that they played for, right? If they're playing for a great team, right, then maybe their points per game is going to be higher than somebody who's really, really good on a bad team. And can we adjust for the quality of the team that they're on? So there's probably some ways to do that. Number of players also on the team that they're playing on when they're drafted, right? Are you playing with 10 other guys that Central Scouting says are really good? Yeah, your stats are probably going to be a little bit inflated. We should probably downgrade for those sorts of things. So anyway, there we go. Brianna, do we have time for a question?
We do have a few minutes.
Awesome.
How about just considering when most of these kids are under 18, the growth rate in like height and weight, and how that correlates to their stats as they mature through the junior leagues or et cetera, and how if that's something you can compensate for is they're adjusting the stats to.
I think if we had that data and I could trust that data, I think it would be something that would probably be of interest. One of the issues here, we took as best we could and found the best and tried to be consistent, particularly in things like height and weight. And if they were drafted, the NHL, for some reason the NHL actually is a good source of data because they actually kept what they listed as their height and weight on draft day. But if they were not drafted, so you're Central Scouting but you weren't drafted, then you're looking at something like elite prospects, and that's probably something that's been updated since they were drafted. So you're looking for contemporaneous reports and trying to scour through old Central Scouting to see, do we have a height and weight listed? So all of that information I think has the potential to improve the model, but getting it I think is a challenge. Good.
I'm going to look up your how to beat the market report, but in that, were you looking for players who significantly outperformed their draft order? In other words, these teams found a diamond in the rough that no one else did. And from that, did you find a stat or stats that said, hey, here's something, or a combination of things that could have predicted this overperforming draftee?
We did not look at any causal factors in there. What we looked at is where a player was ranked by Central Scouting, and then where they were eventually drafted. And if a team took them earlier, did they outperform what we would have expected based upon Central Scouting? So we used Central Scouting as a baseline, and when we looked at what was the difference in where they were taken in the draft, and then what was the difference in the outcome that we would get relative to what we would expect based upon their Central Scouting.
And then did you look in like 3-4 years into their career then?
There we used the same outcome measure. So it was again first 7 years of their career.
Okay.
Again, fairly standard measure there, just given the CPA.
Okay.
Yeah, good. All right, awesome. Thank you.